Welcome to the Memorizing Pharmacology podcast. I'm Tony Guerra, pharmacist and author of the Memorizing Pharmacology book series, bringing you mnemonics, cases, and advice for succeeding in pharmacology. Sign up for the email list at memorizingpharm.com to get your free suffixes cheat sheet, or find our mobile-friendly, self-paced online pharmacology review course at residency.teachable.com/p/mobile. Let's get started with the show. All right, I usually just talk about certain drug names, drug classes, but I know that a number of you have emailed me about it being late in the second, third week of your pharmacology, and things are just a real struggle. So I want to give you a book that is actually not pharmacology, but will help you quite a bit with pharmacology, patho, and a number of other classes. So it's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. It's by Peter Brown and Henry Roediger and Mark McDaniel. And basically it teaches you what myths there are about learning and how some of the ways that you might be trying to study don't work. So if you're anyone who has gone through a ton of note cards and still done poorly on a test, this episode is for you. So if there's one book I would recommend for somebody going to school, as my kids go to college, I would hope they would have this, but I couldn't expect them to maybe read an entire book. Like, okay, Dad, I'll read the whole book, right? So if you can't read the whole book, I would at least start with chapter 8, which is Make It Stick. And although they summarize the entire book in the chapter and talk about stories that are in those chapters, and it's better to read the chapters before. If you only have time for one chapter, then that would be it. But if you only have time for one story to convince you that this is the book for you, I would go to chapter 8 at the 23-minute mark, where they talk about Michael Young, the medical school student, and how he went from getting barely enough of an MCAT score to get into medical school to being the top of his medical school class. And I'm going to give you a couple of kind of pointers that I've used in pharmacology class that I use, but the big problem I have is the discomfort that comes along with some of the recommendations that they make, especially the massed practiced one. Okay, so first of all, the retrieval practice. It feels like you're doing your homework again. But no, you're trying to remember. But it feels like you're failing at something, versus mass practice, which makes you feel like you're succeeding. So the example they give is about someone who's going to just hit fastballs. And you get really good at hitting fastballs, and you feel really good about it. And then later on a different day, you hit curveballs, and you try to hit curveballs and you feel really good about it. You get good at it. But when you try to hit in a game, you don't do very well, because in a game, they don't tell you what's coming, the fastball or the curveball. And the same thing is true here. Might not make sense to do your patho homework and then your pharm homework and then back to your patho homework. But that's kind of how your semester goes. And then within a class, so if you're doing pharmacology and you're talking about respiratory drugs, and then you go to diuretics and then back to respiratory drugs, that may seem like it doesn't make sense, but it'll be a lot easier on the exam when you get those drugs in different orders and so forth. So the first thing is retrieval practice. And I'll show you a little bit what I mean at the end, but it's unfortunate they use the word quizzes and don't make clear what quizzing means. And I'll show you what I believe quizzing means, but I don't think quizzing means multiple choice questions where you can kind of pick up the answer from one of the answer choices. I think it means something a little bit harder. So we'll talk about that. So first one's retrieval practice. Next one is elaboration. So when I'm in discussion, I want the student to elaborate on their answer. Okay, they got it right. But let's hear your own words. And so if I'm talking about, okay, well, what's a second generation antihistamine? They say loratadine. Great, they've answered the question. Okay, but now I want them to expand. All right, well, why did they need loratadine? Well, because you don't want an antihistamine making somebody drowsy. Okay, well, how did they make it from the drowsy antihistamine, like diphenhydramine and Benadryl, into something that isn't drowsy? Well, they figured out how to make it not go through the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so you don't go through the blood-brain barrier, And now that avoids drowsiness. So now that you have kind of a little story that goes with it, you now know diphenhydramine or Benadryl is first generation, makes you drowsy, and loratadine, which is Claritin, is non-drowsy. Why? Because it doesn't go through the blood-brain barrier to get to your brain to make you sleepy. Okay, so that kind of elaboration helps. The other elaboration is talking about something in your own situation where, oh yeah, I used to take Claritin, and I remember those Claritin Clear commercials where you hear, oh, Claritin Clear, clearing your sinuses or clearing your, well, it's really an antihistamine, so clearing your allergies is maybe better. Okay, so again, elaboration. That's why the instructor keeps talking, even though you've answered the question, because if you elaborate, you have a story to go with it. It sticks in your brain. Then spaced practice. I think this is the one thing that's the toughest to kind of put together, which is studying 3 times as much. They say that you should study 3 times, but no, it's studying 3 times to study less. So what I mean by that is when you're studying, let's say you are going to study total 3 hours over a whole week. If you spend those 3 hours the night before, it's much less useful than if you spent it on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday before maybe a test on Monday, right? So that's really hard to do because you say, well, I'm so behind. Well, you're so behind because you're spending all of that time. And what you find is that you don't actually need to study 3 hours each time, that you find that you only need to study half an hour each time, and that you get another hour and a half back to study for another class. So spaced practice, just pick 3 days. They can be together, so if you're studying for a Monday test and class is on Friday, just, okay, that's going to be Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Okay. Or if you have a class on Wednesday, then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, something like that. But try to space it out at least a day so that you've got this time for your brain to kind of process what was going on. You come back to it. You're like, oh, okay, I remember. And then all of a sudden, some, I would call revelations come to you like, oh, I made this connection or that connection. You literally need to sleep on it to make it work better. Sharing. This is one that often students hate, which is when they get called on and it's like, well, am I doing my homework again? Why am I sharing this? Well, if you go to the pyramid, the learning pyramid, you see that there's, at the top, it's lecture. You get about 5% retention. And at the bottom, it's 90% for someone who is teaching it. So when you are sharing and when you are presenting to the class, maybe you're just called on, you'll remember that question. And you don't really think about it because it maybe happens once or twice or maybe even 3 times in a class. But the more you're sharing, the more you're going to remember. And it feels uncomfortable at the time, but it doesn't feel uncomfortable when you do really well in the exam. Okay. All right, so let's go on to mnemonics. This is one thing that everybody seems to know me for. So Tony PharmD, the mnemonic guy. I'm not supposed to memorize, I'm supposed to understand, right? Well, mnemonics are for building structures for understanding. So if you're trying to remember loop diuretics, if you can put a mnemonic in that gets you from the glomerulus to the collecting duct on the right, that can put the diuretics in order of mannitol, then furosemide, then hydrochlorothiazide, then spironolactone. Well, you understand that there is more diuresis at the beginning with mannitol and a little bit less at furosemide, a little bit less at hydrochlorothiazide, and then certainly less when spironolactone. So mnemonics aren't just, okay, I memorized it. It's that you've memorized it in an order that makes sense pathophysiologically or physiologically. So let's take a look at that learning pyramid. I think it's a little bit misunderstood. But the big thing is that when you are in discussion, so maybe you have a recitation where you break out and you talk to your professor, and that's when you're learning. Well, the more you're part of the discussion, the more you're getting to that 50% retention, that you'll remember about half of it. Okay? However, if they give you an activity like sorting medications into certain drug classes and saying, okay, well, go ahead and on your own, go ahead and try to sort the diuretics from glomerulus to the collecting duct. Okay, as you do that, that's the practice doing. And then when you get called on and you show others and tell others what you've learned, that's the teaching part. You get 90%. So it's almost 100% that you are going to remember what you were called on for. So it's almost like if you really want to do well on the test, you want to get called on for every question. Obviously, it's not true, but the wanting to get called on with every question. But the whole point is that you're teaching others. So again, the more you participate in the discussion, the more you practice by doing the activities that were assigned, and the more you help others, and that's why people get paired up or put in 3s or 4s so that you can show others what you learned. The more you do these guys, the better off you are. The more you sit and listen or just read, it's just not going to work anywhere near as well. So let's see what that looks like. Here's kind of my half of the pyramid that I care about: the discussion, the practice doing, and the teaching others. So I did write a book, Memorizing Pharmacology and Mnemonics, and the point wasn't for you to just absorb it like a lecture. It was, okay, I learned this cool mnemonic, I want to share it with you. That's how you learn it. So I won't belabor that. But here's an example of one of those mnemonics, and I only took part of it because they're pretty detailed, because it's meant for advanced pharmacology, really, those that are really going into clinical care and those types of things. So what are 4 second-generation antihistamines? Okay, easy enough. Go find them: cetirizine, desloratadine, levocetirizine, loratadine. Okay, well, it's the alphabetical list of them. It's often what you have on the other side of a note card. So the question is, how can we change this in such a way that it's more valuable to us? Well, we put a mnemonic together and we say, well, the order or the prescription called for non-drowsy. So C, cetirizine; A, avoid drowsiness; L, levocetirizine; L, loratadine; E, entering the brain is prohibited, is how that happens; and then D, desloratadine, is Clarinex. And so this is what's in your brain, all of these things. But I don't tend to put them on the cards because you don't want to muddle the cards so much that your brain can't remember what's what. But tear sounds an awful lot like tears from allergy tears. Cetirizine should be 2nd generation before levocetirizine, which is 3rd, because 2 comes before 3. The avoid drowsiness is what a 2nd and 3rd generation antihistamine does. Loratadine, well, that had the Claritin Clear commercials, so that would be easier to remember the allergies. You can kind of picture that sunshiny, very blue sky day. And we would want the 3rd generation, desloratadine, 3rd generation, after it. Clarinex is the next Claritin, right? So it's 3rd generation. And how does it all work? How did diphenhydramine go to loratadine? Well, entering the brain is prohibited. The mechanism of action of non-drowsy versus drowsy is that somebody figured out that, well, if I give the histamine to not go into the brain, then it won't make someone drowsy. But really, we want this kind of nice, clean, clear type of note card. So we're not sitting there, muddled with all of that other clutter. But that's definitely how I would do it. So again, really, if you're really stuck and you just need to hear a story, I really recommend Chapter 8, the story about Michael Young. I think it's one that's both inspirational and telling, as how someone who barely made it into medical school ended up at the top of his medical school class. And this applies to pharmacists and nurses and other health professionals. But I know you're maybe discouraged if you're, again, your 2nd or 3rd week of classes and pharmacology is kicking your butt. Well, the way to kind of turn that around is to really understand what you should be doing and going back to those lessons, retrieval practice, where you ask yourself the question, if you can't remember it before the test, how are you going to remember it on the test? So you really want to do that ahead of time. And then that spaced practice, so important to study on different days rather than try to keep it all for one day, because that's not really, that short-term memory doesn't work as well as the work that you're going to do to get it into long-term memory. Thanks for listening to the Memorizing Pharmacology podcast. You can find episodes, cheat sheets, and more at memorizingpharm.com. Again, you can sign up for the email list at memorizingpharm.com to get your free suffixes cheat sheet, or find our mobile-friendly, self-paced online pharmacology review course at residency.teachable.com/p/mobile. Thanks again for listening.